This is the new Dragon Quest III HD-2D Collector's Edition. A brand new remake that marks the first mainline Dragon Quest release outside of Japan in 5 years, and the next in a long line of excellent remakes and re-releases. But what makes Dragon Quest Remakes so great? Let's take a look at some of the series' best, including remakes that never made it outside of Japan. And then we'll return and take a look at Dragon Quest III HD-2D and why I think it's so important. Dragon Quest IV originally released on the Famicom and was, for the time, very impressive. Many of us will be familiar with the DS remake, but many of the improvements found in this version actually originated in the Japan-only PS1 release, although there were plans for an English release of the game, at least in North America for certain, but sadly, that never ended up happening. This version introduced the beloved party chat feature, which was first seen in Dragon Quest VII, also on the PS1. As well as adding a prologue, a 6th chapter with a bonus dungeon, and generally a lot of overall improvements to the game. New locations, new playable characters, and so on. The game ran on Dragon Quest VII's engine, allowing for camera rotation, zooming, and making the game much more interactive overall. In my opinion, this is the release which really set the tone for Dragon Quest remakes going forward, that they're not just ports with graphical improvements, but rather that they go above and beyond to deliver something new, so that even if you've played the original game, it's worth returning. I wish that they'd continued that for the English release of Dragon Quest IV on the DS, as they did for the Japanese version on the DS, but in the English version they removed party chat as a cost-saving measure because they weren't sure about performance over here, and having to translate a very large amount of dialogue, too much of a risk for them, it seems. But hey, the community fixed that anyway. And the game sold well, which allowed them to carry the party chat feature into Dragon Quest V and VI on the DS anyway. So hey, silver linings. As a fan favourite, Dragon Quest V holds a special place in the series. Even going so far as spawning a movie by the director of Godzilla Minus One, Takashi Yamazaki, although, granted, not quite to the same quality as Godzilla Minus One. But hey, I liked the movie, but this video's not about that. This game saw a DS remake similar to that of Dragon Quest IV, but again, that's not the remake we're going to be talking about. Not first, at least. In 2004, Dragon Quest V saw a pretty ambitious PS2 remake. Going to full 3D with a live orchestral arrangement for a soundtrack which sounds immaculate, as well as countless improvements over the Super Famicom release, including many more recruitable monsters than the original game's somewhat limited roster. The DS version did expand that roster a little bit more, although not a great deal, and added an additional option for marrying Deborah as wife option number 3. But for me, if I had to pick which one to play today, the excellent PS2 remake would be my personal choice. I just think it's the best version, unless you really want to marry Deborah, in which case, absolutely, go for the DS version. But the ambition and charm of the PS2 version, I'm partial to PS2 graphics overall because it's mainly what I grew up with, but to me it just really exemplifies the reasons that I love Dragon Quest Remakes. This one is a little bit more subjective, and I'm going to call this one more of an honourable mention because of that, but it absolutely deserves to be here. Dragon Quest VII represents a different sort of remake for the Dragon Quest franchise, one that focused more on streamlining the overall experience, while still adding some of the extras that you'd expect. Originally released on the PS1, Dragon Quest VII is known for its, should we say, size. Not necessarily just its scope, although it is a big game, but more just how long everything takes. It's a bit of a love it or hate it game. Some people find it boring and stale, other people like it. The game is very well known for its very slow start, with the streamlined 3DS release shaving off almost 2 hours. Visually, the game is brought into full stereoscopic 3D, although in my opinion it doesn't look as nice as the Dragon Quest V PS2 remake, but again, I'm partial to PS2 graphics, so your mileage may vary. Encounters are no longer random, as monsters can be seen in the overworld, so you can avoid them. And that is a big improvement for a lot of people, as random encounters are not everybody's cup of tea. This change is also the case in the 3DS remake of Dragon Quest VIII, although I don't have a section for it in this video because, as you might expect, the excellent PS2 remake, Dragon Quest V PS2 remake, I'm partial to PS2 graphics, so PS2. So I prefer the original PS2 release because it's the first one I played and it's PS2 and I'm partial to the charm of PS2 games. But on the flip side, my girlfriend tried the PS2 release of Dragon Quest VIII and really could not get into it, but she actually enjoyed the 3DS release, so maybe I'm the weird one. To be fair, the Dragon Quest VIII remake did have new characters, more content, a lot of quality of life improvements, but regardless, back to Dragon Quest VII. They added a radar to make stone fragments more easily findable, new characters, and an overall much more welcoming experience. The entire vocation system was simplified and rebalanced to make it more approachable and streamlined, which, as I said, was very much the focus of this remake. Along with a revised orchestral soundtrack and an arguably much better English translation, but that depends on whether you're looking for a literal translation from Japanese or the more modern localizations with all of the various English dialects and characterization. But regardless, these changes make the 3DS version the definitive version for a lot of people, although a lot of people do still argue that a lot of these changes ruined the pacing of the original game. But Dragon Quest VII had some of the most drastic changes of any Dragon Quest remake. And that's without even mentioning the DLC tablets, which grant rewards, new NPCs, encounters, and even additional scenarios and story. And that brings us to today, and the Dragon Quest III HD-2D remake. Dragon Quest III HD-2D was announced nearly 3.5 years ago, and since then it has been by far my most anticipated game in a very long time. And the game is finally out. It released yesterday, as long as I get this video out in decent time. And this game is the single greatest rework of a Dragon Quest game to date. And I can't think of a Dragon Quest game more deserving of such a brilliant remake. The game which sold over 1 million units in a single day, which was practically unheard of for the time, and was responsible for quite a large number of arrests for people not attending school without good reason. But I get it, I totally wouldn't have gone to school either. The remake adopts Square Enix's HD 2D style seen in games like Octopath Traveler, Triangle Strategy, and so on. I love all those games and I love this style. There are a non-zero number of people who really don't like the HD 2D with its heavy-handed use of things like bloom effects. And the original announcement video showcased what looked very much like an Octopath Traveler-esque game. Don't get me wrong, it looked really good, but it looked a bit smaller scale than I'd have thought for a Dragon Quest game. And thankfully, in the much later follow-up trailer, they completely reworked the original design, and by far, in my opinion, Dragon Quest III HD 2D implements the style the best. Everything is just much more expansive, moving away from a more one-to-one of the original Dragon Quest III into a more reimagined, larger version of the world. Everything just looks absolutely stunning. But as we've established, this is still a Dragon Quest remake, which means the improvements go beyond just surface level. Now, don't get me wrong, what you see on the surface is exceptional, but this release really feels like a celebration of one of the greatest games of all time. really expanding on the world, the gameplay and the lore, with additional flashback sequences and story episodes about Ortega, the hero's father. That's such a welcome addition because I really felt in the original like he was sort of pushed to the side and I think he deserved a bit more spotlight. And for his story to be built and expanded on a little bit more, which finally this game does. And then, for the first time in Dragon Quest III, the game has voice acting.
Cooey, wakey wakey, rise and shine.
Now the game isn't fully voice acted by any means, but Dragon Quest games aren't. However, cutscenes and certain story sequences all have complete voice acting, bringing voices to these characters for the first time.
Well met, child of Ortega.
It's a Dragon Quest game, so I go for the English dub. Normally in these games I tend not to like the English dub, but I always feel like Dragon Quest does such a great job. And I really think that's also the case here. There's been a small rework of the combat system, adding non-magic abilities, which is a pretty mainstay feature in the Dragon Quest franchise now, but was not around when Dragon Quest III initially released. And with that, we get a whole new class. Now I remember when they first showed the Collector's Edition and all of the acrylic stands of the classes that were going to be included in the Collector's Edition, and people were screenshotting these two here going, oh, is that a new class? Which is pretty obvious it was. If anyone's played Dragon Quest X, which you should, then you'd be very familiar with this class. Let me just set up my little arrangement again. That class is Monster Wrangler, a class which was first introduced in Dragon Quest X, and then was also marked as Saro's class in Dragon Quest Monsters The Dark Prince. And that makes sense, because it's a class that relies on making allies of monsters and using their abilities to help you in battle. Further still, we have the addition of monster arenas, where monsters you rescue throughout the course of the game can be used in battle, and if you win rewards in tournaments. There are new monsters, bosses, and overall the game is just so well expanded. I'm not covering all the changes because, first of all, I haven't fully looked into it because I want to largely experience the game myself, and I'm still playing it. And I think that if you're interested in playing Dragon Quest III HD-2D, you should experience it for yourself. I'm personally still quite early into the game because I got it on the release date, It arrived at about 5 PM, roughly when the game unlocked in my region digitally anyway. And from what I've played so far, it's absolutely everything I could have hoped for. Dragon Quest III HD-2D really solidifies itself to me and showcases that Dragon Quest Remakes are something special. This game and Dragon Quest 1 and 2 remakes, which are to follow at some point, are very, very important. Because historically, Dragon Quest games have not been left to history. Early on, it was every console, it seemed, they were going, right, let's re-release it, with some improvements, with new graphics, with new content. There are a few Dragon Quest games now that it's been a while. They're still playable, whether it's through a console game or, in the case of many, on mobile. But if these games sell well, and I really hope they will, despite all of the controversy, just maybe we'll get modern remakes of the Zenithian trilogy, whether it's in the HD-2D style or some sort of 3D remake. We can only hope that more is to follow, but I think they will. That's just about it for this video. I really love Dragon Quest Remakes, if that's not abundantly clear. That's all from me. I'm gonna now go back and play some Dragon Quest III HD 2D. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.